So I'm Peter from England, married to an American. We have 6 children, no grandchildren, but I'm performing the first wedding in 2 weeks, less than 2 weeks, so that's exciting. Get back from here on Thursday and then leave Friday for America for the wedding. So try to make it through a day without crying. We'll see what happens, but it's exciting. This is my, 11th or something forum. Interesting fact, I once danced in Scottish dress, even though I'm English, forgive me, in front of about 1,500 Koreans in Los Angeles on slippery carpet. It was quite bizarre. Anyway, that's random. Well, it's great to be together, and the plan for the week is just to explain the foundational networker through the partition in the other room. Everybody who comes on this network goes through that one first, and that kind of repeats every year. Well, it doesn't kind of, it definitely repeats. It's the same content every time. I think, Helder, you've spoken in there, haven't you, with that group? Oh, great, thank you. And then after that, people come in here if they want to, or they serve to other networks, that's also allowed. But this one's different every year. So we'll change our focus because some of you are regulars. And so our focus this year is Mark's Gospel. Our goal is not to be exhaustive with Mark. Our goal is to have a conversation center where Mark is what we're focusing on, but we'll let our conversation go where it goes in terms of preaching and teaching God's word, because that's really the focus of this network. So hopefully by the end of this week, you'll enjoy Mark and the time we spend in it, but hopefully also you'll feel equipped and resourced and whatever the other key words are for ELF for going and preaching and teaching from Mark and from the whole Bible. Okay, and so we're getting Malachi in the morning, we're getting Mark in this session. I really hope that we can go home renewed and encouraged as Bible teachers. Whether you're preaching several times a week or leading a home group or teaching or preaching once in a while, I'm not concerned about that. This isn't a competition between us at all. But the vision, I think, is really important. If we talk about renewing the biblical church and evangelizing Europe, I think this is a really strategic network. Because if you think about all the churches spread across Europe, if the diet that they were getting is just healthy, right? We're not saying the best preaching in the entire world ever. That's reserved for certain events and, certain preachers and editing and so on that makes us think they're perfect. But just a steady diet of good Bible content, that is biblically solid and pointing hearts to Christ. So it's not an education exercise, it's a transformation exercise, right? If that's happening on a steady basis, the potential of the church in Europe is huge. I often think of how my wife can produce an incredible meal, and sometimes she does if we have guests or something. Actually, she does it less because as the kids have got older, they've taken that on, and thankfully, they're all good cooks too, so I'm very blessed. But over the years, I think of the number of meals that have been prepared in our house that are not spectacular. But they've got the basic elements, they're properly cooked, the chicken isn't raw, it's safe and it's healthy. And as long as we can stop the children from baking too many cookies, then the diet is good. And what happens over the years, they grow and they get bigger and healthier and eventually get married, which is bizarre. But that's the fruit, not of the spectacular meal they had in 2012. It's the fruit of the meals every day, being able to feed their bodies. And if you think of churches in those terms, if churches across Europe were getting just a steady diet of, look what it says, isn't this wonderful? Look at God's heart, look at Christ, and just a consistent feeding. It doesn't have to be the kind of stunning sermon that makes it into a biblical preaching textbook. Let me tell you one story about that. I had several really special teachers that I'm so thankful for on preaching. One of them published a book in 2007. Really good book. I know from talking to him and from kind of looking it up, one of the sermons that he uses in the book, he preached in 1980. What does that mean? He preached it in 1980. He published the book in 2007. He probably preached, 2,000, 3,000 times between them. Why did he use that one? Probably because a lot of these were not quite that special. And yet God used that ministry. And so that's really my vision for this network, is that we would go away with a passion for good preaching. Not high dreams of the best preaching ever or being famous or any of that weird stuff, but just steady diet of Bible and what could happen in our churches. So let me just mention them, and then I'll explain the unique pricing system, which is, I think, really exciting and should take off all over the world. But a few different titles. You can have a good look at them. But Pleased to Dwell, a biblical introduction to the incarnation. The book with straw on it goes through the whole Bible, thinking about the wonder of God the Son becoming one of us. And I really enjoyed that, so I kind of took the same recipe and then wrote Lost in Wonder, a biblical introduction to God's great marriage. So again, Genesis to Revelation, thinking about the wonder of God marrying the redeemed, which is just mind-blowingly good, and also looking at the human marriages as a reflection or a non-reflection of that through the Bible. So in fact, all of them are basically a lot of Bible rather than a lot of stories. So if you want to know about family road trips and all that kind of stuff, don't buy my books, okay? Because I don't find that stuff particularly interesting. So I just kind of explain Bible and try to do it engagingly. So hopefully that's helpful. And then this is my latest, the Little Hymn Book, HIM. I was speaking to one of the guys at the publishing house. He said, I'm not sure about the title. I said, why not? He said, I think it's going to confuse people. I said, why? He said, well, I think people are going to think that you think that Jesus is small. I said, really? I don't think people are going to think that. I think they're going to think, oh, that's a play on words, like a hymn book, but it's about him. And so it's just an introduction to Jesus, looking at the Jesus who makes our hearts sing. That was a strange conversation, but what can I say? Okay, so enough about that. Just wanted to mention those early so you know they're there. Okay, so let's jump into our introductory session to Mark's Gospel. Let me ask you this. When you hear Mark's Gospel, what is the first thing that comes to mind? It can be obscure, it can be what people think, it can be a particular passage. What comes to mind when you think of Mark? Anything?
Cursing the fig tree.
Short? Yeah, shortest Gospel.
Cursing the fig tree.
Yeah, okay. You love cursing trees as well, or? It's a challenging one, yeah? What else?
On the last week.
Yeah. Focus on the week of the Passion, yeah? Okay. Say again?
Drama.
Yeah, the drama. Has anyone seen the Mark drama? It's actually a thing, yeah, Mark drama. Let me just explain that now I've said it. It's a ministry out of the UK that uses the Gospel of Mark and presents it in a dramatic form. And I think one of the beauties of that is that it helps you to realize how engaging the drama of Mark is. So it's an amazing ministry. We've done it in our church 3 times, so I've been in it 6 times because we always had 2 performances. First rehearsal, Thursday evening. Second rehearsal, Friday evening. Third rehearsal, all day Saturday. Then Saturday evening, perform the whole of Mark's Gospel to a crowd of people. And I don't know why, but every single time I've been cast as a Pharisee. Not sure. Maybe my height. Let's just call it that, shall we? But it's interesting that the Pharisee role is kind of negative and antagonistic, obviously, throughout. And especially at the cross, it's just vicious. And it was heartbreaking to just scream in the face of my good friend who was representing Jesus. And the crowd, like, whoa, it's just overwhelming. The first half of the drama is fun, it's energetic, it's enjoyable. It's like, wow, I didn't realize the Bible had so much humor in it. And then the second half just gets more and more intense. And by the end, the cross is just, whoa, what have we just experienced? Then afterwards, everyone in the church who knew us coming up to my kids, is your dad like that at home? They're like, no, we've never seen him like that. I'm like, thank you. That's not how I discipline my kids. But yeah, the Mark drama, if you ever have the opportunity to experience it, well worth it. But actually just read the gospel with your imagination turned on. It is a drama. Anything else about Mark?
Hardness of heart.
Say again?
Hardness of heart.
Hardness of heart, yeah.
The puzzle of the ending.
Yes. Yeah. The ending. What do you do with it? And when do you stop? It's a puzzle for preachers, isn't it? You're planning your series and you're like, ooh, do we stop at verse 8? Do we keep going? Do we explain why we're ignoring a chunk of the Bible, if it's Bible? I mean, it's a tricky one. Yeah? Anything else? Say again? Yes. The naked young man. I always laugh about that because I had a teacher at Bible school who put it in a test. Who is the naked young man? And he gave 4 options, and 2 of them were other faculty members. I'm like, well, I'm supposed to be in serious Bible school here, and I'm reading this question, and you could tell when everyone got to the question because they all chuckled, and carried on. Yeah, something over here? Yeah, immediately. Boom, boom, boom. Yeah, absolutely. Well, the notes that you've got in your app, in the old days, I don't want to sound nostalgic about ELF, but in the old days, like the hungry days and the early days here, you'd get a folder with all your notes printed in, and it was really nice because everyone's looking at the same thing. Oh, look at you, you're well prepared. Now, it's all on the app, and so I've got notes, and no one's looking at them, or many people aren't. That's okay. What it means is I don't need to quote every reference and you write it down. Okay, so you can just relax and enjoy and ask questions or whatever. But I'm just going to move through the notes because this is really an introductory session just to kind of get us thinking about Mark. Next session after the coffee break, Andy Hamilton will be in here. Andy teaches in Rome at the Bible Institute. Great guy, and you'll enjoy him. And he's going to kind of look in that first section of Mark a little bit more. Not the intro, but the first 2 or 3 chapters. So, whose gospel is it? We call it Mark's. Technically, it's anonymous, but attributed by, how do you say it, Papias? Around 125 AD to John Mark. So that's quite early. He's calling it John Mark's gospel, companion of Paul and later of Peter. So Mark had this unique connection. All right, a younger man, potentially, and this would explain the naked thing, potentially in the family of the home where the Last Supper was held. You sort of imagine teenager, something like that, this thing's going on, why are they having the Last Supper, or I mean, didn't call it that, but why is this thing happening? Maybe listening when he should have been in bed, and then they go out and he follows, typical teenager, and then in the melee at the arrest, he flees naked. Why would he mention that? Well, maybe because it was him. That's a common view on that. So John Mark was potentially, likely an eyewitness, and then a companion of both Paul and Peter. That's not a bad CV, is it? If you're going to write a gospel, which is a completely new form of literature, actually, I think Mark's probably a good candidate for that. And so Papias was the first to identify with him, and I honestly haven't spent the time going through the critical literature to find out how much discussion there is about that, because I don't really care, to be honest. Like, it's what's in our Bible that matters. Okay, so it's dated around 65-ish, somewhere in there. It's the earliest, the first gospel, and as I said, it's a new form of literature. We call it a gospel, like, oh, gospel, Actually, there was no a gospel before Mark wrote this. Once he wrote this, then Matthew and Luke read this and probably said, that's great, I've got an idea. And so they wrote theirs using Mark, but adding something else. So Matthew gives us the 5 blocks of teaching that he probably took notes on when he was listening to Jesus and brought that emphasis out a bit more. Luke, and not an eyewitness, but a good bedside manner question asker. Maybe that's a fair way to put it. Spoke to Mary, spoke to the different ones involved, and wrote a really careful account. And he seems to emphasize more parables and short stories and so on. But there's massive amounts of Mark in both. And then John, My opinion, I'm not going to take a bullet for this, but my opinion is that John almost certainly read Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I think it's a bizarre notion that he came up with something so different without seeing them. For one example, if you're one of the 3 disciples who's on the Mount of Transfiguration and you're going to write a gospel, are you going to miss that out? I wouldn't. I was there, saw his glory. But John knows that's been covered. That's been well handled in all 3 Gospels. He doesn't mention the Transfiguration. Things like that make me think John read Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I'm supposing, because I believe the best about these people, that he liked Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He wasn't critical of them, but he wrote a completely different Gospel. Much more in the south than in the north, much more long conversations and interactions instead of short stories, kind of a carefully selected set of signs and all the crafting in John. But we're not doing John this week, so I'll leave it at that. But Mark was the pioneer. He wrote a passion narrative with an extended introduction. That's how Mark's been described a lot in commentaries. A passion narrative, that long chunk of material dealing with the final week, and then not a dissimilar amount of introductory material to get you to that. That's the gospel, right? So that kind of idea. Mark wrote lots of action, right? Lots of action. Where are we? 2 blocks of teaching, so chapter 4 and chapter 13, they sort of sit in the middle of the 2 halves. So he starts in the first half, there's one block. In the second half, there's another block. But it's not like Matthew, where it's teaching, action, teaching, back and forth. It's action with some teaching in the middle of that. He wrote, and this is the thing that I really want us to grasp, he wrote with a literary and theological sophistication. Some people will say, Mark, that's the plain gospel. Almost as if you want a really good one, you want to go Matthew, Luke, or John. Mark, that's for beginners. I want us to throw that idea away and start to appreciate Mark for the masterpiece that it is. Okay, I'm not saying it's better than the others. We've got 4, praise the Lord, they're all wonderful. But let's not say, there's 3 good ones and 1 plain one. That does bother me when I hear that kind of thing. Okay, so little hints here. I'm not going to be exhaustive, but just a few things. He's energetic in his storytelling. Most sentences in the Greek begin with and, and it doesn't get translated like that because it would fail, modern English language classes. You don't keep starting with an and. But in that language, in that time, that was quite possible, and he did it. And so it just keeps on moving. And to speed it up, he uses immediately, 41 times. Immediately. Imagine a stage production. It's like this is happening, boom, this is happening, whoa, this is happening, and that immediately just keeps your focus moving from one thing to the next. And so it's hard to get a sense of time, but that's not the point of it. In fact, if we didn't have John's gospel, we would probably think that the ministry of Jesus took about, 27 Sabbaths, something like that. It does seem like Jesus got busy on Sabbath, doesn't it? So you can count the Sabbaths, and that's vague memory, don't quote me on that. But a few months would be the ministry of Jesus. But John gives us the feasts, so it pushes us into at least 3 calendar years, maybe 4. So that's a little bit of knowledge from John that's helpful. But when you're reading Mark, his goal is not to say, and on the 17th day of February, he's not concerned about that. He wants you to feel the energy. He's driving the story forward. So immediately it's just taking you forward. Next thing. The Aramaic words of Jesus are used 6 times. Now you might think, well, so what? That's one of many ways that we're shown that this is eyewitness material. If this was made up later, why would you quote specific original language phrasing? But if you're an eyewitness, or you're basing your book on eyewitness content, then I think that's actually quite significant. Have any of you seen The Chosen? TV, drama, it's worth watching. Not saying everything's completely right, but I'm stunned how good it is so far. And it's really developing the story of Jesus through the perspective of the disciples, which is just gripping. We love it in our family. Wonderful thing to be watching. Preview it if you've got small children, especially the first episode. But it's really good. And there's little things in that I so appreciate. The number of times that you see one of the disciples, Matthew especially, taking notes. I think that's historically on target, because there's so much evidence that in the Gospels, they didn't just retell the story from their memory from 50 years earlier. They're actually quoting. There's evidence of word-perfect quotation. All right, there's evidence of being there in terms of the names. You can chase some of those evidences for the Gospels on the ELF website. Just look up Peter Williams, Gospel Evidence. There's probably several talks on there. Fascinating. Dirk Yonkin too. So yeah, Aramaic words of Jesus. This is eyewitness material. It's not vaguely written later, vague history. Jesus as the Messiah is well developed in Mark. Okay, so we get the kingly Messiah, as in the anointed king. We get God's suffering servant, and we get this thing that's referred to as the secret, the Markan secret. Okay, so when you're reading through Mark with a simple or simplistic idea, you're going to think, oh, this is Jesus presenting himself. He wants to get the word out, and then he keeps saying, shh, don't tell anyone. That's really confusing. And so that happens on multiple occasions. He silences demons, probably a good example to follow. The crowds are told to keep it secret on at least 4 occasions. The disciples are told to keep it secret. And so it seems like Jesus is doing miracles and doing things that seem to show who he is, and then immediately saying, shh, don't tell anyone. Go home. Don't spread this. And then those who should know who he is don't. That's one of the things that when you really look at the first half of Mark, you can get caught up in the energy and the miracles and the excitement. But if you slow down and look carefully, it's actually quite striking that his disciples don't get it. Right? The religious experts don't get it. His own family don't get it. These are the people that should get it. The only ones that seem to get it are demons or desperate people, and they're told to be quiet. And so it kind of creates a question in your mind, right? As you're going through those first 8 chapters, what's going on? Why isn't he like fanning the flames of his popularity? Why isn't he trying to go viral in his ministry? So that's a good question to keep in mind and to ponder. Now, there's lots of things we could do with Mark. I just want to give you one little taste of something that may be unfamiliar. Maybe it's familiar. But Isaiah has a huge influence on Mark. Okay, so Isaiah, or Isaiah for Lindsay, is an Old Testament prophet, 700 years BC. Obviously, we're familiar with Isaiah's prophecy, but we may miss how much he is influential in Mark's gospel. I've got one of the commentaries on my shelf is called Isaiah's New Exodus, as a sort of subtitle. And it's going through the Gospel of Mark, showing that Isaiah's anticipation of this future act of God that's kind of going to replace the old Exodus of Exodus fame. This is coming. This is going to happen. And so Mark uses Isaiah all the way through. Let me just throw some examples at you. The first sentence, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus, the Christ, the King of Israel, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet, instantly goes to Isaiah. Jesus takes Israel's role, goes through the water, and then is tested in the desert. Mark quotes Isaiah, chapter 4, chapter 7, chapter 9, chapter 11. Jesus' ministry is described in the language of Isaiah. Isaiah 53, the suffering servant. Mark 10:45, which is the pinnacle verse of Mark's gospel. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. I think Isaiah 53 is influencing that. The parable of the tenants in Mark 12 is very related to Isaiah 5. Eyes that see but don't perceive, ears that hear but don't it's Isaiah 6 kind of concept. The long-awaited deliverer is come, but he has come to suffer before leading the people into the final promised land, Mark 13. And so once you start seeing it, be careful you don't get carried away and confuse your church. Because that kind of, you know what I mean? That kind of Bible awareness is great for PhDs. When you're writing your PhD, you've got to find that kind of stuff. Sometimes means that PhDs haven't found something and they're making it up. But, generally speaking, that's a very PhD kind of a piece of work. Know your audience. When you're preaching, if they can't get their head around Isaiah, that's 700 years apart, totally different parts of the Bible. Preach Mark, preach what they can see. But you want to be aware of that stuff because it's going to influence your understanding of it. Okay, so just a little thought, but we do need to know more than we preach. And therefore, this can be helpful. Last one, the Messiah's mission includes the gathering of the Gentile nations. So there's Gentile narratives, end of 6 through to the middle of 9 or end of 9. The abolishing of food laws, the temple repossessed, Jesus referring to the temple using Isaiah 56. My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. So Isaiah is not the only Old Testament book that's feeding into Mark, but it feels like the biggest one. Other things are a little bit more incidental, but with that amount of material, it kind of makes it worth going through. As a preacher, as somebody who's not reading Mark for the first time, you're studying it maybe personally or with a slightly more advanced group, which is probably not going to be a preaching session, right? Unless you're at a conference. In your church, probably not worth thinking these are advanced because hopefully there will be guests present. And I can just imagine the confusion in someone's mind. They're already having to go 2,000 years to follow you with Mark. If you then start throwing in 700 years before that, okay, I quit. I'm thinking about football, which, of course, we shouldn't be doing, right, comrade? Less football in our thinking. So we don't want to feed that in our churches by preaching at a sophisticated level that loses people. That's not the point you were making, but, I think that's important. So that all that stuff, all those quotes are in your notes, and if you want to chase that, Ricky Watts is mentioned at the end in the sort of bibliography. But let's think more big picture. Really simple. If you had to explain Mark's gospel quickly, for me, I find it really helpful to think about Mark in two halves. Okay? And actually, even before we figure out the two halves, just recognize the wording. Mark 1:1. This is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus. And then we're told two things about him. What are they? Jesus, the Christ, and the Son of God. Okay, so those two titles are so familiar, we can just skim on past it. Right, let's get to the action. Now, this is the beginning of the good news about Jesus, who is the Christ, the Son of God. And that kind of sets us up for the book. And so the first half of the book, from that sentence on, Jesus is doing a whole load of ministry and miracles and action, and there's some teaching in there, and it's moving forward at a pace, but the people are not getting who he is. But as the reader, we know who he is, because Mark told us in the first verse. Right? He thought we would notice that. This is the gospel of Jesus, the Christ, the Son of God. And so we have this awareness, and everybody on the stage in the action doesn't have that awareness apart from demons, right? So the people you'd expect, family, disciples, religious leaders, not getting it, don't see it, can't follow, not tracking. And it's weird, isn't it, to kind of watch somebody, actually it's used in films all the time, where you've got some inside knowledge and the characters don't have it. If you're unfortunate enough to read Shakespeare, that's constantly what's going on. Something that you know, they don't know, and you're watching it all play out. So, first 8 chapters, this is Jesus. Who is he? He's the Christ. Now, when does Jesus finally get called the Christ? It's at the midpoint. At a key moment in Mark 8, when Jesus says to his disciples, who do the people say that I am? Oh, some say this, some say that. What about you? Who do you say that I am? Remember what Peter says? You are the Christ. Whoa. Finally. And Peter gets excited, and then it gets a bit awkward. We'll look at that later in the week. But that's a key moment. It feels like a big moment because they've not been getting it. They've been going through repeated action. It feels like the story's repeating itself. Go across the lake, have a conversation about bread, do a miracle, and then do it again. And then a man that needs healing in 2 stages, and then they see, and Peter says, you're the Christ. You think, great, we've got this, the Christ business, finally out there. What's the other part? The Son of God. Who says this was surely the Son of God? That's the centurion at the cross. And so you've got these start, middle, end moments. First verse, the Christ, the Son of God. The hinge at the middle, you're the Christ. And then finally at the cross, the person who was stood closest to it, who had the best view of Jesus dying, declared, Son of God. We don't know exactly, there's complexity to that, obviously, coming from a centurion's mouth, but literarily, it's powerful, isn't it? Hopefully, if you've really read it through tears, you can kind of see what he's seen and say, yes, he is. I've known that since the first verse. And it's at the cross that we can finally see that, which is really interesting. Theologically, so many Christians in our churches assume that the cross was a sort of an unfortunate, negative thing that Jesus had to get through to get back to the glory, right? To get back to the big stuff, the real thing that matters. To see that the cross actually is the key moment of revelation. That's a very John's gospel way of saying it. I'm trying to avoid sounding like I'm teaching John, but actually Mark's kind of doing the same thing, isn't he? He's saying, okay, how can we really see that this is the Son of God? Watch this. This is the Son of God. And so you've got the introduction, you've got the hinge in the middle, and you've got the climax in terms of the theological climax, I suppose, at the cross. And actually with Mark, it really doesn't have much after that. Buried, they came, he's not there. Right? Unless you like the long ending, and then you've got all sorts of weird things that you don't find anywhere else. Okay, so the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. You are the Christ, Mark 8:29. Truly, this man was the Son of God, 15:39. Donald English, in his little commentary in the Bible Speaks Today series, I think, isn't it? They've got quite a few copies in the bookstore, so if you need it, just an easy, accessible commentary, it's actually really good. He really makes a point that there's 2 questions being answered. And I think he's absolutely spot on. The first question is, who is Jesus? And the second question is, what does it mean to follow him? And those 2 questions kind of cover the 2 halves. Okay, so this is the Jesus, the Christ, the Son of God, but nobody knows who he is. But you're reading it and you know who he is, and so you're presented with this tension all the way through of, but he's the Christ, the Son of God. Why aren't they seeing it? Why aren't they getting it? So who is Jesus? Is coming through that first half. Finally, Peter says, you're the Christ. And then Jesus starts talking about the cross. And we'll look at that in detail sometime tomorrow or the day after, I don't know, I lose track. ELF, what day is it? It's the greatest mystery, isn't it? But the moment Jesus says, you're the Christ, Jesus says, I'm going to the cross. I think that helps us to understand the secret. All right, oh, Jesus did a miracle. I'm going to tell the world. No, don't tell anyone. Miracle. Why doesn't Jesus want everybody to know about the miracles? Because if you have a Messiah that's all miracles with no cross, you haven't understood the Messiah. I think that's the key to this. It's so easy, isn't it, in human nature to be like, yeah, my Jesus heals. My Jesus, does stuff. My Jesus can solve your problems. And we can end up preaching something that isn't even half a gospel. We can start preaching almost like a Jesus was the really good healer, and you need to really ask him and he can really fix your troubles, and have a crossless Christianity, which is madness. There's no such thing. And so Mark's gospel is protecting us from that. All right, so keep it quiet, keep it quiet. Not because Jesus didn't want people to know, not because Jesus had a sort of weird, sort of awkward, false humility or something. No, it's genuinely, I think, because people would get carried away and miss the point. And he would just become a source of more food, a source of more healings, a source of more bless me. Once it comes clear for Peter, you're the Christ, okay, I'm going to the cross. That transition is so critical. Okay, good, you've got that. Now, you've got to get this. You cannot have Christ without the cross. That's why that midpoint in chapter 8 is so, so important. You cannot have Christ without the cross. You cannot just have the performance of miracles without the passion, right? You've got to have the whole thing. You can't just pick and choose. And Mark's protecting us from that. And so who is Jesus? Once you get he's the Christ, then he's still got to get you to the point of really understanding that he's the Son of God, which ultimately is revealed on the cross. So the who is Jesus question is, of course, the whole gospel. But once you get to that midpoint, you're the Christ, okay, I'm going to the cross. And you take up your cross and follow. And we'll see when we look at that section, they didn't get it. Right? You get that whole weird thing going on of Jesus saying, I'm going to the cross and this is going to happen and this is going to happen and this is going to happen. And the disciples are like, yeah, so when you come into your kingdom, can we sit, one on each side? And we read that and we think, oh, these disciples are so dense. Until we realize actually that's human nature and we would have said exactly the same thing. Right? We would have been right in there annoyed with James and John and their mum because we didn't ask the question first. It's not pretty, is it? When you let the Bible be like a mirror to the depths of your own depravity. But Mark's doing that. And Jesus is saying, not only am I the Christ who's going to the cross, you've got to take up your cross to follow me. Being a follower is not about being the attendant at a miracle crusade and getting somewhat, blessed with the glory of it. Being a follower of Jesus means taking up your cross and suffering, following in the footsteps of your suffering Messiah. And so who is Jesus? What does it mean to follow him? That kind of an overview, I think, is really helpful when you're preaching a gospel. People cannot get their heads around the structure of something in complexity. And so what we tend to do as preachers is we say, hey, new series, we're doing Mark's Gospel. Great, Mark's Gospel, whatever. And then we go, right, first 9 verses. Or first 13, if you're going to be generous, Next week, all right, verse 14 to 20. Next week, okay, this to this. How long does it take them to lose the big picture? They've never had it. And so it's just like being immersed into a story. They know it ends at the cross. So that's helpful. It's like they've read the back of the DVD. Like, okay, there's a hint here, he's going to die. But if we're going to preach a long series, then I think as preachers or teachers, we need to think about, giving people the bird's eye view so that they can enjoy the detail, right? And one way to do that is with that kind of simplicity, the Christ and the cross, two halves. Even week 1, give them the first verse. I mean, if we're going to preach a series in Mark, I'm not a fan of preaching a series that takes 2.5 years. All right? I just feel in my church experience, that's a very long time until you can inject energy for something new. So I would rather go in shorter blocks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks. But if I was doing something like Mark, which we did it in several series so that each series had its own energy. All right, so I don't remember the title we used, but we'd have a series title, and maybe we're just preaching Mark 1 to 3. Then maybe do chapter 4 in home groups or something, and then maybe do the next section in another series. And it took about 1.5 years, but it was several series. Now, what that means is we've got flexibility. We're not confined by the section headings in our Bibles that we have to always do a section. And so if you've got freedom to break it up, if you've got freedom, I mean, if you're in a church and everyone just loves, let's have the longest series ever, let's beat Lloyd Jones and let's see if we can hit 2 decades for one series. If that's your church, okay, bless you. But whichever way you go, you've got the flexibility to say, preaching Mark 1:1, and I'm going to give an overview of the whole thing. So that then in every other sermon you can refer to the overview and people can feel like they know where they are. Okay, so let's be creative in a series, especially long ones, so we don't get lost in the middle. You're spending, I hope, hours studying every week or every time you preach. I don't want to be unrealistic like some people, but hopefully it's not 10 minutes, right? Hopefully it has to take some time. They're not doing that. And so you've got a whole load of knowledge they haven't got. So if you can give them simple ways to access the structure, to understand the flow, the big picture, it helps them to deal with the details. Let me give you a chance to look at the beginning or the prologue of Mark. So in your Bible or in the notes, I've put Mark 1, and I know the prologue goes to verse 13, but I've added 14 and 15 because that kind of gives us Jesus' feet on the ground, action is happening. I always think of this section as being, I don't say this necessarily when I'm preaching it, but I think of it as being sort of the smoke machine section. You know, at the start of John, the prologue is familiar. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And there was a man, and he did this, and now this, you know. And it's a bit like if you were going to present John on a stage, it would be very hard to act out those first 18 verses. You almost need to have just smoke and a voice, you know, the narrator. But then the smoke clears and characters are on stage. Mark 1 is kind of similar. It feels a bit smoky. There's this, and there's this, and there's this. It's important, don't misunderstand me. But I want you to read that section, and I just want you to notice what you notice. Don't try to be sophisticated. Don't try to be, you know, proving yourself to the person you're sat next to. Just be a humble Bible reader. Read it as the start of the gospel, and let's just see what we notice. Not going to do anything more sophisticated than that. In future sessions, we'll think a little bit more about how to look and, you know, scribble on the page and all that kind of stuff. But for now, let's just read it and take the simple question, what do you notice? What seems important? What stands out? Just one quick thought and we should finish. If you don't see, either in conversation or from your own knowledge or from reading commentaries, if you don't see the richness of the Old Testament feeding into this, you can't really understand this or preach it. But when you preach it, don't overwhelm people with that so that they feel like they're supposed to know their table of contents better. You know, it's possible to cover the Isaiah, what have we had? Elijah, Ezekiel, New Covenant. You can cover those things with passing references in a sermon and still make the emphasis what Mark is trying to get across, rather than, whoa, that was complex. That's not our goal. Our goal is to do in our message what Mark was doing in his text. All right, and he's not trying to show off his Old Testament knowledge. He's driving something home.